Welcome everyone. Welcome students, faculty, staff, alumni, and friends of the School of Architecture at UNC Charlotte. We're very excited as we continue to celebrate our 50th anniversary this year about today's lecturer. I'm thrilled that we have Beatriz Colomina joining us. And we get to see one kind of lens, Beatriz's lens on some of the history of architecture that we're revisiting from the past 5 decades as we continue to think about the future and how this history might begin to shape the next 50 years of architecture. And in this space with us, we have Cathy Zhang and Peter Wong, who are the faculty curators of this year's lecture series, as well as the symposium in the spring and our colloquia series. We also have Thomas Forget, a faculty member who will host a panel of students for question and answer after Colomina's talk. And I'm really excited to hear that discussion as well. And with that, I will hand it off to Cathy.
All right, thank you, Blaine. And thanks everyone for attending the lecture today. My name is Cathy Zhang, and I'm Assistant Professor of Architecture here at the SoA. It's my great honor to introduce today's speaker, Beatriz Colomina, an internationally renowned architectural historian, theorist, researcher, educator, curator, and writer. She's the founding director of the Media and Modernity program at Princeton University, the Howard Crosby Butler Professor of the History of Architecture, and the Director of Graduate Studies in the School of Architecture at Princeton. She has written extensively on questions of design, art, sexuality, and media. She has published more than 100 articles, and her writings have been translated into more than 25 languages. Both of her books, Sexuality and Space and Privacy and Publicity, Modern Architecture as Mass Media, were awarded the International Book Award by the AIA in 1993 and 1995. Other books she wrote include Domesticity at War, published in 2007, Manifesto Architecture, The Ghost of Mies in 2014, The Century of the Bed in 2015, Are We Human? Notes on Archaeology of Design, published in 2016 with Mark Wigley, to name a few. Her latest book, X-ray Architecture, traces the psychopathology of 20th century architecture and how the medical discourse and imaging technologies that make visible of the inside have instigated transformations of the privacy and publicity. Beatriz suggests that each new instrument of medical diagnosis implied new positions for design and new systems of architectural representation. Beatriz has curated a number of exhibitions, including Clip Stamp Fold in 2006, Playboy Architecture in 2012, and Radical Pedagogies in 2014. In 2016, she was the co-curator of the 3rd Istanbul Design Biennial on the theme, Are We Human? One of the ongoing topics she has been exploring through the spectrum of her work is the bed as a unique horizontal architecture. Her contribution, titled The 24/7 Bed to the Dutch Pavilion in the 2018 Venice Architecture Biennale, looked at the bed as a workspace transforming labor. And more recent article, Diary of a Disease, brings forward questions about the mutational relationship of the architecture and the bed in the age of COVID-19. Beatriz has been the recipient of diverse awards and fellowships, including Grant Foundation grants, the Canadian Center for Architecture Mellon Fellowship, the American Academy in Berlin, and the Getty Center in Los Angeles. In 2020, she was awarded the Ada Louis Huxtable Prize for her contributions to the field of architecture. We really look forward to hearing her explorations on the topic of Sikh architecture in today's lecture, as well as discussion afterwards. Please join me in welcoming Professor Beatriz Colomina.
Thank you very much. I'm really super honored to have been invited to celebrate the 50th anniversary of your school. Thank you very much, Blaine, for your invitation, and thank you very much to all the people that have made it possible. And thank you so much, Kathy, for your very generous introduction. I look forward to talking with the students also, and with all of you, Thomas and Kathy, afterwards. So thank you very much for your invitation. I'm going to try to share my screen now. We could start with this lecture that I have titled Sick Architecture from Tuberculosis to COVID-19. See if we can play from the start. Okay, see well, right? Okay, wonderful. Sick architecture from COVID, from tuberculosis to COVID is in a way part of the research that I have done for my last book on tuberculosis and modern architecture. The book is called X-ray Architecture. But in many ways, the topic became very relevant in the context of COVID, right? When we start thinking about how illnesses are affecting the ways in which we live, right? So I wanted to start with this image because in fact, and this since we don't have a lot of time, I would like to emphasize this point that architecture has always been understood in terms of a body. But if you think about it, it's always, whether it's in the Renaissance or in modern architecture, it tends to be this athletic, white male body that is endlessly redrawn in multiple versions, from the Renaissance treatises to modern architecture manifestos, so from Leonardo, let's say the famous Man of Leonardo, to Le Corbusier. So a perfect body in a way that is immersed in a geometric system of proportions. Yet what I'm trying to argue is that the real body of architecture is not at all a healthy body, as we usually think about, but it's more a fragile body that is prone to disease or already sick and in need of support. And in that sense, architecture acts as a kind of orthopedic support, a kind of crutch or artificial skin, if you want, for this fragile creature. And architecture discourse from the beginning, you can argue that it's medical. The architect is a kind of doctor. Buildings are medical instruments. This is the substance of what I'm going to present. And architecture somehow derives its apparent strength from the weakness of its occupants, which are the perceived illnesses of their time. And to start with, I wanted to present you with these images, which are precisely from the present, this grid of white beds in a dark cavernous space that are waiting for patients, or waiting for bodies. One architecture in a way has been made inside another. This is a field hospital that was established in Madrid in what used to be, in what it still is, a convention hall, in a few days to accommodate 5,500 patients of COVID. But it was, of course, not just Madrid, but also in Serbia. You have here Belgrade, or you can think about the Javits Center in New York. Also, all of a sudden, a convention center turned into a hospital, into a field hospital with these beds, or the field hospital that was established outside the Mount Sinai Hospital in Central Park in New York. And so many other images that you may have in mind. But I wanted to point out too that this is actually an old story that we may have forgotten, that we have already been here in many ways. Think, for example, about the flu pandemic in the United States of 1918, where you already see images such as these, of thousands of beds somehow in a field hospital occupying these cavernous spaces. But another important thing here is that sick architecture is really not simply the architecture of medical emergencies, On the contrary, it is the architecture, if you want, of normality, the way in which somehow past health crises are inscribed into the everyday, right? And each architecture somehow carries the traces of previous diseases, something that we tend to forget about. So in fact, you can argue that all architecture is sick, that illness or architecture are inseparable, that the beginning of architecture is the beginning of disease, as already this Dr. Benjamin Ward Richardson argue in this book called Our Homes and How to Make Them Healthy, which is a compendium of texts written by architects and doctors on the occasion of the 1884 International Health Exhibition in London. And here you have some of the illustrations of this exhibition. Of course, a lot of architecture in this health exhibition always, and the plan of the exhibition and the cover of the guide to the International Health Exhibition, which, as you can see in the illustrations, is of course full of architecture and how to make the house healthier, right? Not only the equipment, but all the different ways in which you can eliminate or reduce contagion and disease. But the point that I wanted to emphasize here is what he says, as I say in the introduction to this book, when he writes, and I'm going to only read the last part of the quote, that man, in constructing protection from exposure, has constructed the conditions of disease, right? So this is already in 1884. So what are they saying, right? What are they saying? That there is actually no disease without architecture. That the moment we move indoors, we created the conditions for all kinds of diseases, as has been demonstrated in studies and excavations of the Neolithic that demonstrate, for example, that tuberculosis started in this moment. So again, because of this situation that there is no disease without architecture and no architecture without disease, doctors and architects have always been in some kind of dance, kind of exchanging roles, collaborating, influencing each other. So furniture, as you saw in this illustration, rooms, buildings, but even entire cities are produced by medical emergencies that layer on top of each other for centuries. But the remarkable thing is that we tend to forget very quickly what produces these layers. As soon as an emergency is over, and you will see this with COVID, we develop collective amnesia. We don't remember anything anymore. So we act as if pandemic is the first, right? I think, for example, about the surprise when we were required to wear masks, but we have been there before. Think about all these nurses in Boston during the flu epidemic of 1918 wearing masks, and the population was also wearing masks. But you can also go back to the plague doctors of the 17th century who wore this long this mask with a very long beak, which is supposed to keep people at bay, but also in the beak also will have stented herbs, which was a way to kind of prevent disease, because the miasma theory of the disease was that contagion was through the smell, and therefore they tried to counter this with these smells that were introduced in the mask. Or think about the similarities between some of the images that we have from the past, like cholera in Palermo in 1835, with these two characters picking up a body in the streets, the waiting carriage, etc. And these images that you may have seen in the press, that people in cities like New York, saw in person in the early days of the pandemic, frightening images of these medics dressed basically like astronauts, with oxygen tanks and the patient encased in this plastic bubble, almost reminiscent of the 60s architecture, again the waiting vehicle. So we've been there before, and nevertheless we act, as I say, as each pandemic is the first, right? So on the contrary, and this is what I want you to think about, even if I'm not going to go into much detail about this, you can argue that the history of the city is the history of disease. that the pandemics of the 19th century, for example, brought with it the infrastructure that we still have in our cities, like the clean water and the sewage and the urban parks and all these things that were put in place to counter disease. This is, for example, the construction of the embankment in London during the Great Sting, the Great Plague of the 19th century, right? And of course, it's not just the city, but also architecture that is affected by these theories of disease, this fear of contagion. So in a way, you could write a very interesting history of architecture and history of the city that will only focus on health, on disease, on the way in which cities are accumulation of layer upon layer of infrastructure that was put in place to prevent the previous pandemic, right? So we are always one step behind. But also, if you even expand the question historically, you realize that the beginning of architectural theory is already the beginning of this relationship between architecture and medicine. For example, Vitruvius, which is of course understood as being the first architectural theory, the architect that launched Western architectural theory, insisted precisely that all architects needed to study medicine. I like to say that to students of architecture, because if you didn't have enough already studying architecture, imagine that now you have to study medicine as well. And why Vitruvius argued? Precisely because health is the main objective of the architect. And actually he dedicates a large part of his 10 books on architecture to the question of health. And these of course are the volumes that were printed in the Renaissance of the Vitruvius books. He gives very detailed instructions on how to choose a particular site so that it's healthy, by returning to the ancient practice of sacrificing an animal that lives there and inspecting the liver to make sure that it's health and sound and firm. If it is, then this is a healthy site for the city. But he also discusses the theory of the four humors, which was of course the prevalent theory, the dominant theory of health at the time, emphasizing the direction of the winds and of the sun for a healthy building, right? But it's also very interesting how he turns it around, and turns out that those who are unwell, those who are sick, can be cured by architecture. So architecture all of a sudden is the cure for certain diseases. In particular, he points out that architecture can rebuild the system of those exhausted by disease, including consumption. And of course, consumption is an old word for tuberculosis. So even already in the first century BC, you have this idea that architecture can cure tuberculosis. By the Renaissance, which is when the first schools of architecture or design were established, is very interesting because they could have established, these schools could have established themselves everywhere, right? We are talking about Florence in 1563, with the first Accademia del Disegno, the first Academy of Design, founded by Giorgio Vasari. And it's very interesting because they place themselves next to the medical schools. And the students of architecture were required to attend dissection in the same way that the medical students were required to attend dissection, except that the students of architecture were also supposed to draw this decomposing body, even if there were reports that they were getting sick and all of the above. Nevertheless, they have to keep there drawing this body. Likewise, have been at the same time that medicine tried to understand the mysterious interior of the body by cutting into it. All of a sudden, architects decide that the section is also very important for them. right? So in the sketchbooks, and I don't have the image right now, I see, but in the sketchbooks, but you remember them, of Leonardo da Vinci, you have, for example, cutaway views of architecture interiors next to anatomical drawings of the brain or of the womb, right? So this parallel is also very interesting. Now, as medical representations change the architectural representation, and it's interesting to note that, and I'm going to make a big jump here into the 20th century, that the X-ray and the widespread use of the X-ray made a new way of thinking about architecture possible. And modern buildings even started to look like medical images with these transparent glass walls revealing the inner secrets of a structure. So the point that I'm trying to make is that the architecture of the 20th century, which we have been analyzing from every single point of view, is actually the result of this relationship with disease, and in particular with tuberculosis, which was really the obsession of that period. And it's so much so that until still in 1952, you have here the cover of this very important architectural magazine, the Revista Nacional de Arquitectura of Madrid, could put still in the cover in 1952 a modern building superimposed to this X-ray of the chest and the sun. So the association between modern architecture and tuberculosis was not a secret, and nevertheless, in architectural histories, we have tried to avoid this connection between modern architecture and tuberculosis. And nevertheless, you can argue that modern architecture was also produced in emergency conditions. In fact, millions of people were dying of tuberculosis in the late 19th century and the first half of the millions were dying every year, not millions were dying, right? And all the defining features of modern architecture, everything you can think about, wide walls, terraces, big windows, detachment from the ground, were presented actually by architects as a way to prevent, if not to cure, tuberculosis. So we're still like in a way like in Vitruvius, or buildings can prevent this devastating disease that is killing people all over the world. To give you a sense of how dramatic this crisis was, 1 in 7 people in the planet were dying of tuberculosis at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. In the United States, it was 1 in 5. But if you went to dense cities like Paris, it was more like 1 in 3. So if you think that COVID is bad, this was a lot more dramatic, right? So here are some images of the open air school, for example, where healthy kids are asked to be doing their homework and attending classes in open air schools as a way to prevent precisely tuberculosis. All these images that you are also familiar with of these athletic bodies that occupy modern architecture, and this fascination that I don't have a lot of time to go into with the X-ray. So people like Mies van der Rohe, of course, the architect signer of the glass skyscraper, which was in 1922, which was not realized, but nevertheless, it's impossible to imagine this this building, this rendering of a building that was never possibly realized. Nobody knew how to do a glass building, a glass skyscraper in 1922. Is very much the effect of an X-ray, right? And not only that, but Mies himself was completely fascinated by X-rays, collected X-rays, etc. I mean, all of them were, but is clearly demonstrable. So all the designing features of modern architecture, wide walls, terraces, detachment from the ground, were presented as prevention and as cure. For example, Le Corbusier talks about the pilotis, the famous pilotis, as detaching the building from the humid ground where disease breeds. So there is this still this very miasmatic theory of the disease that is the ground, is the miasma that produces disease. So how do we go to present then modern architecture? We have to first demonize 19th century architecture. How do we, because this is the poster of the famous Siedlung in Stuttgart, this great exhibition in which so many modern architects participated. And on the right you have the house of Le Corbusier, this white house, again demonstrating all the principles of modern architecture. But it's not this house or a Miss house or anybody's house that you put in the cover. In the cover or in the poster, we put exactly what we don't want to happen. It's this big X over a 19th century interior full of decoration, full of carpets, full of things where disease is understood to be hiding, right? Because it was a great belief that the bacillus of tuberculosis was hiding in the dust, and it's actually correct. So the curative excess was treated itself as an infection, and modernizing architecture was first of all a form of disinfection, kind of a purification of the building, leading to a health-giving environment of light, air, cleanliness, etc. So these smooth surfaces of modern architecture also don't have any cracks, any kind of crevices where disease and contagion might lurk, right? And it's also fascinating to know that women were advised also to leave Petri dishes in the United States in particular, but also in Europe, Petri dishes in their living rooms to make sure that they not simply have cleaned their living room, but they have eliminated all kinds of bacteria. So the housewife becomes kind of a bacteriologist, and the house is kind of her laboratory, right? So as I said before, we tend to think about architecture in terms of this healthy exercise body that we have also seen represented in all these illustrations of modern architecture. But in fact, as I was trying to emphasize before, the center of architecture, the real body of architecture, is this fragile body that is prone to sickness or already sick, and it needs support, right? And architecture is kind of support of this fragile body. And I'm going to try to demonstrate this by going to a very famous building, the Painio Sanatorium of Aino and Alvar Aalto in Finland, in Painio of 1929-33. And I insist on Aino and Alvar Aalto, and I will tell you in passing that it's remarkable how in the publication of this building at the time of its construction, they have no problem crediting the building to Alvar Aalto and Aino Aalto. The first book on the sanatorium puts both names in the title, and also all the architects that were involved in the construction of the building. And with time, it's like we develop amnesia too, and all of a sudden, all of these people have disappeared, and it's only Alvar Aalto. But it's a different story. So here you have some images of this building with these kind of dramatic terraces in the sky, and this extraordinary building. But I wanted to emphasize how the bedrooms are totally clean and devoid again of ornament, as it has been argued in the Weissenhof Siedlung. Everything, all the furniture, which is designed by the architects, by the way, is done in a way to minimize any kind of surfaces where dust could accumulate. Dust is the biggest enemy. So even the intersection of the floor and the wall beneath the window, as you can see, is curved precisely to avoid this dust buildup. Now, this thing of the dust makes sound to you like, what is that about? It is correct. I mean, if somebody with tuberculosis spits and that spontaneity is now dry, 15 days later, it's still contagious. But if it is exposed to the sign, even for just a few minutes, it gets neutralized. So they were onto something, that the dust was something to be eliminated, right? The rooms were also fitted with all this furniture and the sanitary things that were completely designed by the architects, and it included this famous Painio chair that has a back to kind of allow facilitate breathing and expectoration, and sinks designed to reduce splashing, and espitons to minimize sounds, and even these door handles that were also designed not to catch the doctor's sleeves in the white coats. But the main equipment of the building is this top terrace, 7 stories above the forest, where patients were wheeled out to take regular doses of fresh air and sun. This is the so-called cure that was common in all the sanatorium. By the way, this was between the hours of 7 a.m. and 10 p.m. or something like that, incredible. And they are lying in these beautiful chairs designed by Aino Alto. And here you have even Aino Alto herself photograph lying on the chairs that she designed for Painio. So that's also very interesting. You know, the architect not as the heroic figure, athletic, healthy, in front of her building, but the architect in a way like a sick person lying on the chairs of Painio. Tuberculosis made modern architecture, here you have another image of all these patients lying on the chairs, very dramatic. Tuberculosis made modern architecture modern, and I really say it in that sense, not in the sense that modern architects build modern sanatoriums. That would be too easy. In fact, you'll be surprised to know that Aalto was a perfectly good neoclassic architect before his so-called, he calls it himself that way, conversion to functionalism. So he describes his turn to modern architecture as a kind of religious awakening, conversion to functionalism. He says in 1927, when he entered into a competition for a tuberculosis sanatorium in Kinkoma, also in Finland, which he didn't win, but it is unrealized project in many ways, as you can see in this image of horizontal lines and wide terraces for the cure, anticipates Painio. It's very interesting that Aalto says that sanatoriums are not at the service of architecture, but at the service of medicine, but on the contrary, they are integral to medicine itself. It's an apparatus, he says, devised as a means of treatment. So he now is conceiving architecture as a medical apparatus. In fact, he writes specifically, the main purpose of the building is to function as a medical instrument. The room design is determined by the depleted strength of a patient reclining in the bed. And there are these very beautiful drawings of this patient that is lying on the bed. It's also interesting to know that Aalto, and we tend to kind of put aside all these biographical things about architects, but I think it's important that Aalto himself had been sick at the time of the commission of the competition for the building. And he actually claims that having to lie in bed for a very extended period of time, he doesn't say what he had, but it was a big kind of taboo around tuberculosis, so he probably had tuberculosis. He says that having to lie in bed for an extended period of time had been crucial to his understanding on the problem. And then he says something really interesting, and there are drawings that I like very much too that he does in the context of a lecture in which he's explaining this. He says architecture has always been conceived for the vertical person. Here is the vertical person. But here you have a client that is permanently on the horizontal. And of course, the whole design of the room and of the building, according to him, had to change. The light fixtures, for example, cannot remain in the ceiling as in the top drawing, because it will irritate the eyes of those lying on the bed, or the view through the window to the forest outside had to be particularly calculated from the point of view of those in bed. For example, here in the terrace, you see very clear this very low parapet and very thin rail that allow the eye of this horizontal person to kind of travel above the forest. he also talks very much about the colors. The colors are very important. He talks about quiet, dark hues of blue for the ceiling and the walls in lighter shades as for the bedrooms. Then he talks about bright canary yellow in the reception booth, by the entrance, in the linoleum of the lobby, in the staircases and in the corridors, to evoke, he says, sunny optimism, even in cold and cloudy days. Because that's the next thing that he talks about, which is how psychological factors are also very important, right? And this is very interesting, you know, how the architect is not paying attention to the health of the occupant, but also to the psychology of the occupant. He writes, an extended period of confinement can be extremely depressing for a bedridden patient. A tuberculosis sanatorium is, to all intents and purposes, a house with open windows. So the hospital, he argues, had to be thought as a new kind of house. That's kind of normal. Okay, you want to make the hospital more hospitable, and you make it more like a house. That's kind of a normal thought. But what I found it fascinating is when he reverses, and then he says the generic house needs to be more like a sanatorium, right? And this is where we are approaching what modern architecture will become. He says, I was able to discover that special physical and psychological reactions by patients provide good pointers for ordinary housing. So to examine how humans react to forms and constructions is useful to use for experimentation, especially sensitive people, he says, such as patients in a sanatorium. So the bodily, if you want, and psychological kind of sensitivity of the sick person is used to recalibrate architecture. Even the very specialized furniture designed for Painio became, as you very well known, ordinary pieces of furniture. So, for example, the cantilever bridge Painio chair that I mentioned before, and that it was designed to open the chest of the patient, allowing them to breathe easier, soon enough became everybody's chair. And likewise with the rest of the furniture for Painio. At the time of the construction of the sanatorium, they wrote, the sanatorium needs furniture which should be light, flexible, easy to clean, hygienic, right, and so on. And after an extensive experimentation in wood, the flexible system was discovered to produce, they say, furniture which was more suitable for the long and painful life in the sanatorium. So we have to think about this furniture being designed for the painful and long and painful life in a sanatorium. Then a workshop was established outside the sanatorium, and all the furniture for Painio was produced there. But this is the amazing thing. 2 years later, Artec appears. So basically, the company, the Finnish furniture company that they still exist, starts producing the same furniture that was designed for Painio for everybody. And it's also interesting to read in the first publicity of Artec that they write, the ambition is to support and nourish human beings, physical and psychological, again, well-being, right? So again, these experiments that were done for Painio became everybody's furniture. The reference point, in other words, was the seriously ill. And Aalto, in fact, claims, and this is absolutely fascinating to me, that the architect should always design for the person in the weakest position. So it's completely the opposite of this idea that we have had from the Renaissance of designing always for this athletic, male, able body, right? When in fact he's saying that the architect should always design for the person in the weakest position. It makes you think about how relevant this is in the context of our current preoccupation, obviously with disabilities, with people with disabilities. And in fact, this is something that started in the 1970s, and you may be curious to know that architecture students were involved in campus like Berkeley, where many people coming from the war in Korea and the war in Vietnam were living, and were at a certain point the students of architecture team up with with disabled individuals on campus that want to make the campus and housing more accessible to them, and they established this center for the study of and gave way to the American with Disability Act. But if you think about it, we haven't progressed that much. We add ramps to buildings, we add contraptions that don't work very well for anybody, right? So maybe this is like the road not taking in a way that already in 1930 or 1920 something, the authors claimed that the architects should design for the person in the weakest position. If you think about it, if you design for the person in the weakest position, everybody else will take care of themselves. So in other words, sicknesses or disability was no longer seen as the exception, but as the norm. And of course, varying degrees of sickness define the human condition. The modern subject suffers from many ailments, physical and psychological, and architecture, we were discussing before, is kind of a protective cocoon, not just against the weather and other external or outside threats, but in modernity, more notably against internal threats, which are psychological and bodily ailments. And if you think about it, we are all, most of our lives disabled in one way or another. I mean, when we're young because we are babies, and all kinds of dangers are present in a house when we are old because we are old, and when we broke a leg, or when we are sick, etc. So only a very small part of our lives is this moment of, if to whoever it happens, not to everybody. Right? It's also interesting that Aalto compared his experiments in Paimio and their application to everyday use to the saturated forms of analysis that scientists use in order to obtain more clear and visible results, such as staining bacteria for microscope examination. So he saw design as a form of medical research, actually, with the sanatorium acting as a kind of research lab for modern architecture, a way of testing architecture, looking at what has been hidden and exposing the invisible forces. And with this, I will move to reflect on the fact that the client of modern architecture is, in fact, in many ways invisible. That if you think about it, Sigmund Freud, the X-ray, bacteriology, and the germ theory of the disease all emerged in a relatively short period of time, and they are all looking about looking inside, acknowledging the invisible, whether it's the unconscious with Freud, or the skeleton, or the micro element of the bacteria, the bacillus of tuberculosis. And the architecture likewise turns itself inside out. The threat is no longer outside, but in the elements, but really in many ways inside, in the invisible, in the micro scale of the bacteria that becomes the basis of furniture such as this, but also of rooms, of houses, and of cities. In a way, you can talk about the micro and the macro, the bacterium and the cities. And cities were suddenly seen as teeming with unseen occupants that in many ways became the new clients of modern architecture and urbanism. And the architect slash doctor became also a bacteriologist. So architecture itself becomes bacteria, as Le Corbusier put it in this book, Precisions. This passage that normally is not pay attention, but I think it's really interesting, where he says that we need a diagnosis and a line of contact. In 1922, I tried to delve into an analysis, and I did some laboratory work isolating my microbe. I watched it develop, the biology of my microbe appear in indisputable clarity. Certitudes acquire a diagnosis. Then, by an effort of synthesis, I drew up the fundamental principles of modern city planning. So basically, microbes were both the literal and the metaphorical basis of a new architecture and urbanism. And modern architecture paradoxically had to represent this new invisible order with these bright, transparent images seen as clean, clear, and healthy in a kind of visual hygiene. Or medium in terms of time. Okay, we have a little bit more of time, right? I would like to go a little bit into the history of modern architecture to demonstrate that it's completely full of sanatorium, from Joseph Hoffmann, Burkersdorf, outside Vienna, to all these hospitals in Davos, in Switzerland, like the Queen Alexandra Elizabeth, or you may remember the Zonnestrahl sanatorium in Hilversum in the Netherlands, or Richard Docker sanatorium in Baiblingen. All these images, the whole of modern architecture is full of images of sanatoriums. Many modern architects did a sanatorium, and at some points even defined the sanatorium became like a testing ground for new materials and techniques of construction. And often, and this is something that is not so well known, involve collaborations between architects, engineers, and doctors. Right? So it's very interesting how also these sanatoriums tended to be disconnected from cities, floating like ships on mountains or in forests. Hilversum again by lakes at the coast, with row upon row of terraces, treated like little beaches, sometimes linked to artificial beaches inside of the building, like for example in this place in France with these little kids, or real beaches outside, so sanatoriums. And here you have the nurses examining all these naked bodies in a sanatorium in Odessa. But even the building itself seems to be taking the whole building. Sometimes it's adjusted itself into a kind of solar device, like in this Martel Breuer sanatorium for 1,100 patients, and even more radical, the Nicolas Bisontaille on the right project for a sanatorium in the Alps in 1934. But perhaps the most hilarious of all of them is this collaboration between a radiologist and an architect to make this 25 revolving sanatorium, 16 meters above the ground, that always was facing the sun for the tuberculosis patients in France in 1901, in 1930. It was so successful that somehow they have to establish some sort of a pattern, and in fact they here is in Janmagar in India and in other places where the sanatorium, the revolving sanatorium travel. We have very, speaking about technology, very sophisticated retractable glass panels and specialized focusing instruments, as you can see in this image, to increase the exposure. And even the beds were suspended in these metal frames that enabled them to be rotated to an angle to be aligned with the sun and with the instruments, of course. The sanatorium, as I say before, was from the beginning a laboratory for incubating new attitudes towards form. Take, for example, the Joseph Hoffmann Burkersdorf, which is purify white surfaces, radically sharp lines, cubic furniture, etc. But the interesting thing is that also it's very innovative in terms of construction. It's the first Hennevik reinforced concrete building and also the first use of glass and electricity. And all these things were considered part of the hygienic program. Of course, electricity was considered more hygienic than gas, but it was also used as kind of experimental, for all kinds of experimental therapies with this electric massage and electric bath and chairs for strengthening the nerves. At the time of the construction of the Burkersdorf, the critic Ludwig Hevesi described it as the naked Hoffmann building. So this is how it was understood at the time of its construction, naked, whose walls, he says, are lined with white porcelain tiles, a white painted, white washable wall. He was so enthusiastic that he checked himself into the sanatorium to check all these therapeutic devices. I rapidly made close acquaintances, he says, with electric massage machines. Everything is electric, he says. Electricity itself was understood to be part of the, to be understood as a medical instrument. The building was constructed as an addition to an earlier sanatorium complex that was founded by this neuropsychiatrist, Kraft Ebing, who died before the Purkersdorf was completed, but was very influential in his theories. Kraft Ebing has been argued that the modern metropolis was damaging the nerves of the inhabitants. The nerves is a very important aspect of modern architecture, believe it or not. So it's either tuberculosis or the nerves, nervous conditions of every kind, believed to be caused by the metropolis, right? And that air, light, nature, and simplicity were the most effective therapy. Here are some of the books he published. It's also very interesting to understand that the Purkersdorf was frequented by a very notable circle of patients, including from top left, Gustav Mahler, Arnold Schomburg, Hugo von Hofmannsthal, and Colomina Moser, who had designed the furniture that you saw. And that even the architect Joseph Hoffmann used to check himself in and out of the sanatorium regularly. He had suffered from and was treated for, again, a nervous disorder prior to the commission of the Purkersdorf, and was sympathetic to Kraft Ebing's ideas. The Purkersdorf, and here you have Colomina Moser, who also designed the furniture, and as I said, checked himself in and out regularly, not sure what he suffered from, but here you have a picture that I love from him at the time of the beginning of the Purkersdorf. It's interesting to know that the Purkersdorf accepted patients with all kinds of medical conditions, including nervous disorders of every kind, neurasthenia, eating disorders, substance abuse, and hysteria. The sanatorium had become obviously a new kind of social space for the Viennese upper class and the intelligentsia. Here you have Bert Zuckerkarn, who was a journalist and a critic for the Vienna Allgemeine Zeitung, the newspaper of Vienna. And she describes the Purkersdorf as a cross between a modern hotel and a modern therapeutic center. And here you have Karl Kraus, much more caustic, that describe it as a healing swindle institution. They say they will heal you, but in fact they have no idea what you have. In any case, critics again hail the building as one of clarity and truth. It's interesting to understand that modern was becoming a new and sophisticated taste among the bourgeoisie and the intelligentsia of Vienna, who was supposed to dine around, have dinner around this single white table at the Purkersdorf in a kind of talking cure, and somehow sleep in what they consider at the time Spartan white rooms, and subject themselves to regimes of treatment in white spaces. This association between white and cubic forms with mental and physical health was so strong to act as a kind of effective placebo. And the interesting thing is that this idea was already in literature. If you go back now to read this short, very short, and it's online, you can read it, it's not very long, novel of Thomas Mann, Tristan, that was written in 1903, the same year of the construction of the Purkersdorf, and is set up in an imaginary sanatorium called the Einfried, which again Thomas Mann describes as a long, wide, rectilinear building, warmly recommended for lung patients, but also for patients of all sorts, sufferers of gastric disorder, people with defective hearts, paralytics, rheumatics, nervous disorders of all grumbling. So you can see already in this novel that he understands perfectly well that this sanatorium accepted patients not just with tuberculosis, but basically with every other thing. But the one thing that I wanted to point out here is that when one of the patients in the novel, Hart Klotterhand's wife, that's how they describe her, asked another patient, why are you in the Einfried, really? Why are you in this sanatorium? Really, what cure are you taking? Mr. Espinel. Mr. Espinel answers, cure? Oh, I'm having myself electrify a bit. So like the Purkersdorf, they have electric machines, nothing worth mentioning. I will tell you the real reason why I'm here, madam. It is a feeling for a style. Obviously, people feel one way among furniture that is soft and comfortable and voluptuous, and quite another among the straight lines of these tables, chairs, and draperies. This brightness and hardness, this cold, austere simplicity and reserve strength, madame, it has upon me the ultimate effect of an inward purification and rebirth. Beyond a doubt, is morally elevating. So what do we conclude from this passage? That style is the true cure of whatever afflicts this Mr. Espinel, which, by the way, wears a white jacket and a white hat in all this white building, in a spotless white region, all covered in snow, with this, again, white enamel chairs, white folding doors, white painted gallery, inhabited by the white faces and the white hands of the patients with their white veiled desire by passion driven. So whiteness, if you read this novel, you will see the most insistent feature, not just of the building, but of the landscape and the patients in this Einfried sanatorium. Now, I have a question for you, which is whether we should leave it here. I don't know how we are doing in terms of time. I really need to go back to the studio very soon.
Thank you. I think if you're following thought, I mean, this is fascinating, Beatriz. Thank you so much. I think if there were some further thoughts that might come up as part of the question and answer period, that would be great. Otherwise, yeah, I don't want to cut you off.
I know that that you want to have a conversation, and I was going to go very quickly into the architectural cure, which is all these sanatoriums in Davos, in Switzerland, which became like the site of the famous Thomas Mann novel, The Magic Mountain, where again you have these very strong collaborations between avant-garde young architects from Zurich with avant-garde doctors and avant-garde engineers like Hennevik in the construction of this building, for example, the Schwalbs, which is the only sanatorium that is described by name in the famous novel of Thomas Mann. So it's interesting to know that this most advanced medical treatment coincided with the most advanced technology in architecture, both in terms of engineering and of architecture. Of course, the building may look to you like it's nothing modern, but it's extremely modern. This is 1899, and it's like a 100-meter long facade and endless corridor in which everything is subordinated to the terrace for these patients that were taking the cure in winter and in summer, as I said before, from 7 a.m. To 10 p.m. And this kind of therapy of the chaise longue is also very well described in Thomas Mann, The Magic Mountain, which also was central to the Wald Sanatorium in Davos, which is where Katia Mann, the wife of Thomas Mann, stayed, and that inspired his famous novel, The Magic Mountain. If you read The Magic Mountain, again, you will see how much modern architecture is there, how in great detail Thomas Mann describes these terraces that must have been quite novel at the time. And he describes this social life in this very modern building where everything is white, including the patient here brought in white to receive hydrotherapy. And this is Katia Mann, who had been, was in fact one of the first patients in this brand new sanatorium, the Wald Sanatorium. And she fell ill actually in 1912 after the birth of her fourth child, and her mother, of course, was convinced that she was not suffering from tuberculosis, but from exhaustion, having had 4 children and 2 miscarriages in less than 5 years, managing a large household, and even typing man's manuscript. And it's kind of devastating to know that Katy had been studying mathematics and experimental physics with nothing less than Wilhelm Röntgen, the inventor of the X-ray, but it was her mother that had encouraged her to abandon her studies to marry Thomas Mann at the age of 21. Anyway, whatever her ailments, she stayed in and out of sanatoriums until 1914. And as I said before, this tuberculosis was often confounded with nervous disorders of every kind. So this inevitable melancholy meant that the standard cure was also a psychological one. So sanatoriums, in a way, offered not just an escape from the city, but also from normal domestic life with this comfort of a controlled domestic space, right? And this hyper design space of the clinic represents a form of domestic elegance. In fact, Katy and Mann say that the experience had strengthened her so that she could stand it all. And in fact, I mean, if you think about it, there was a lot to stand. There was World War II, an exile to the United States, then the suicide of her favorite son, Klaus, then of a later son, Michael, so incredible hardship. This gives you the impression that sanatoriums are always for the upper class, and in many ways they were, but somehow the modern kind of ocean liner for the rich and fabulous becomes somehow democratized at a certain point, with sanatoriums such as this one, the Sonnenstrahl in Hilversum, well known in the history of architecture. It's 20 miles outside Amsterdam, and it was designed for the diamond workers union of the Netherlands. And again, you can see it's a reinforced concrete white building, so the medical properties of the architecture are again taken to the stream. And here you have the patients that are now somehow wheeled out of their independent rooms into a terrace. And there is no longer such a social space as in previous sanatoriums, but they seem to keep, the patients seem to keep their head inside the room and into their books. The real interaction is with the sun and with these machines. Well, just to finish, I thought that these individual rooms were kind of an advance in a working class sanatorium. But reading against Thomas Bernhard, I don't know whether you have read Thomas Bernhard, it's a fantastic novelist as well, who spent many years in and out of sanatorium as a tuberculosis patient, and there's a lot of architecture in his novels. I totally recommend it. I then became aware, reading him, that the most terrifying thing in a sanatorium is when you were moved into an individual room. That could mean only one thing, and you were on your way out. Death itself was hidden, and many sanatoriums in Davos and in other places did not accept very ill patients because death was kind of a spot in their reputation. And it's super interesting that in Davos, they discovered recently, doing some renovation, some of these sanatoriums are now luxury hotels, that subterranean tunnels were carrying the dead away. And in the swamp that is here up in the mountains, 300 meters above the city of Davos, the bodies of the dead were sent down the mountain on toboggans in the winter, as Thomas Mann describes in The Magic Mountain. And then I go back to another quote of Thomas Mann in the novel Tristan, where he writes precisely about this question of how death is hidden. Sometimes he says that death takes place among the most severe cases. When this happens, no one knows. Not even the person sleeping next door. In the silence of the night, the boxing guest is put away, and life at the Einfeld goes tranquilly on with his massage, his electric treatments, juices, baths, etc., exercise, steaming machines, inhaling in rooms especially equipped with all the triumphs of modern therapeutic. So death in modernity is always hidden, and perhaps I will finish with this. Visual hygiene means also designing what you don't want to see or don't You don't want to see death. Otto Wagner, for example, famous plan for the Großstadt, for the metropolis of 1911, had high-speed trains. And you may want to ask yourself, what is the rush when you know what are these high-speed trains are to remove the dead, he says, transporting corpses in their coffins from a specially designated mortuary station to the outskirts of the city. Every large city, he says, will soon be in a position to limit the transportation of corpses to the railroad, and it seems therefore proper that its neighborhood will have a mortuary station for that purpose. So in conclusion, some sort of a conclusion, more significant, in fact, that the architecture of the sanatorium is the impact of medical thought on all of modern architecture, the preoccupation with ventilation, with sunlight, with hygiene, with white walls, that turn all buildings into medical equipment. Now I will bring another novel. I think novels are very important to understand what's happening to architecture. And this is The Man Without Qualities of Robert Musil, a novel of 1913 Vienna. And the protagonist, Ulrich, at a certain point says, modern man is born in a hospital and dies in a hospital. Therefore, he should also live in a place like a hospital. So these ideas about hygiene and health are so important in architecture that also were part of the culture can be demonstrated by looking at how architecture is presented in literature. And with this, I will stop the share and hope to see you. Will I stop the share?
Thank you so much. You've given us so much to think about today. I'll just hand it off to Thomas to discuss with the students.
Great. So we've already gotten some great comments in the chat. You can keep those coming. We'll try to get to them if we can. The one by Toby, which I tried to send to everybody, which is sort of about the response, thinking about our COVID response in relationship to modernism's response. I'm going to send that to Joseph. But I just wanted to know my favorite line in the book, which is what is in the back of my head with this question, which is, architects didn't modernize the sanatorium modernized architects. I just kind of think that that is somehow like the Rosetta Stone of how we need to be thinking right now in terms of how we respond without sort of just grabbing onto the low-hanging fruit. And one thing about Toby's, before I pass it to Joseph, I think something in Toby's question is about sort of this need, this desire of just getting back to normal as opposed to getting to something different. So Joseph, you want to take it from there?
Yes. First of all, thank you so much, Beatriz. You kind of piggybacking on that, you mentioned earlier that we, as a society, we kind of develop a collective amnesia. We're kind of reacting, you know, in school and study, in the profession, we're reacting quickly and kind of rotely to the problem because we want to engage it. What do you think is the real time scale of how the discipline will respond to COVID and the degree of kind of self-consciousness that we should have as we respond? Are we going to forget it, or are we going to really take action as designers?
If history is a guide, as a society, we will try to forget it very quickly. So this, I suppose, is part of our evolutionary makeup, right? We try to bury the pain and the uncertainty of the past and move on. Now, if you look at it historically, all architects focus responded to the last emergency. Right, so obviously all the infrastructure of the 19th century responded to the cholera epidemics, and in many ways we're still benefiting from this. Then other diseases emerged, some of them caused by us, For example, you think about Sick Syndrome building. I mean, it would not have existed without modern architecture. We created that monster, right? By producing these buildings that are not, that are not opening the windows, that have air conditioning. We have created these mega bags that produce a new generation of disasters, of medical disaster. So we are both architecture is both the cure and the cause of multiple diseases. And we are in that dance since the beginning of architecture, both claiming that we produce a more healthy architecture because we know very well that whatever we do is always creating a problem or another. Right. So how will we react to COVID? Well, in fact, there have been a lot of reactions already, even at the popular level. Everybody has become an architect in the age of COVID. Everybody all of a sudden knows what 1.5 meters is, or right, or 6 feet is. All these partitions, all these restaurants that have had to create a space outside. All these people at home that have had to kind of improvise ways of working at home with the kids doing their homework, and so we all have become architects, and the whole kind of industry of renovations is the only one that didn't suffer any crisis during it's very difficult to get a new shade or somebody to come to fix something in the kitchen because everybody's doing renovations, right? How will it affect architecture? There are things like tuberculosis that perhaps it's because it stayed for such a long time with us, and it was very difficult to find an antibiotic that was effective. Antibiotics existed, they were effective against all kinds of things, syphilis, I don't know, whatever, but not against tuberculosis. Until 1943, during the war, streptomycin is discovered, and all of a sudden no, because it took 10 years more to make streptomycin available to the general population. Somehow the sanatorium movement died down, and all these big sanatoriums were turned into regular hospitals or into luxury hotels, depending on the circumstances. But for all that time, more than 50 years, the only cure for tuberculosis was really architectural, right? It was environmental, right? Because you have to be in a building with a terrace, you have to take the sun. How do you prevent tuberculosis? You have, Neutra will tell you, you have to have a terrace outside every bedroom. People should sleep outside because that prevents the disease. So both for the prevention and for the cure of tuberculosis, we have modern architecture, and the great success of modern architecture may have had a lot to do with the fact that it was presenting itself as a cure to a really terrible disease. Now, there have been things like the 1918 flu that I mentioned that, kill more people than World War I. But it was relatively short-lived, and then we developed amnesia. We don't remember anything about it, right? But did it have an effect on architecture? Maybe now it's a good time to start thinking, did it or did it not? Because I think about this sink of Le Corbusier in the entrance of Villa Savoie, and I thought to myself, hey, of course you have to wash your hands as you come into the house. For a long time we have thought, oh, he liked sanitary fittings. He did. But I also understand that this idea of the power room at the entrance of the houses in many ways was introduced right after the 1918 flu. So there are ways in which we can think historically about the effect of illnesses in architecture. Now, I'm not a futurologist, obviously, so I have no idea how we will react to COVID, but I have the impression that certain things are here to stay. And many of those things is because they have affected society at a deeper level. I mean, think about what we are doing. Never before would have been this possible. I would not have been able to go to Charlotte for whatever reason. This lecture would not have happened. It would have been rescheduled to another day, right? But here we are doing it on Zoom. Millions of people are not going back to work. At least they are not going back to work in the regular way of 9 to 5 from Monday to Friday. Buildings in Midtown Manhattan are half empty. At the same time, there is an incredible need for housing. So we have to think also about all the societal needs. I mean, could these office buildings be rehabilitated as housing in a moment in which the problem of homelessness is so terrifying, so devastating? Could we also, in light of the damage that we as architects inflict on the environment, think about the possibility of recycling more the buildings that we already have rather than build more and more? So many of these things could happen, right?
I actually think, Katie, you want to, Beatriz set you up well. Katie has sort of an environmental question, I believe.
Okay, great.
That was a perfect transition. Hi, Beatriz. Thanks for your presentation today. I was just curious, when you mentioned that even Vitruvius was mentioning health as a central purpose of architecture, I started thinking about the ways that we've talked about health in my experience at architecture school. And I'd be interested to hear your ideas about how the idea of health has expanded in recent decades beyond the human body in order to deal with ideas like community health and in particular, environmental and ecological health in the face of climate change.
That's totally to the point. We are not only thinking right now, we shouldn't be thinking just about the health of the individual, but also the health of the planet, right? And the multiple ways in which us humans as a species have not only managed to eliminate a whole series of other species, but we are in our way to somehow eliminate ourselves, right? So this incredible drive to destroy the environment ultimately has enormous consequences for us. So we have to take this very, very seriously, obviously. Right? We have to think also about all these species that also live in the planet. I think of very few architects that have taken seriously architecture as a kind of interspecies collaboration with plants and animals. Think about Lina Bobardi, for example, such an important architect who when she was doing her glass house in Sao Paulo, she starts kind of accounting for all the animals and even the insects and that are living in the site, right? So that's part of what we should think as architects as well.
I want to bring Mia in now. I think she has a point to follow up nicely on this. Also something that you mentioned when you were talking about disability in architecture.
Okay, great. These are questions are in the chat or those are new questions? In the chat, there are other questions.
In the chat, well, I'm hoping to get to some of the ones in the chat, but we have an embarrassment of riches right now.
Okay, good, great. So Mia.
Hey, thank you. I was just hoping to ask you a little bit about how health has changed in the recent years with movements such as the fat positivity movement and advancements towards accessibility and a wider discussion and conversation about ableism. And so how that relates to what we see as a healthy body and where that fits into architecture.
Yeah, very important. I mean, I think that's why I started with this idea that we are guilty as a discipline, because we have always presented this kind of athletic, male, white body at the center of this geometric system of proportions, whether it's
Looks like we've lost her, hopefully temporarily. Greer, do you have a protocol for this?
unfortunately.
I imagine she's popping off and
trying to rejoin. Yeah.
We'll pop back on. I liked the comment by Maddie's comment was really, I'm not sure if you're getting my copy and paste in the main room, but Maddie's comment, the irony of the cruise ships, which is of course inspired by the sort of sanatorium modern architecture and vice versa, you know, becoming such an iconic part of our pandemic in the beginning, with those ships being stranded. Another question from Danielle that came in was really one for Beatriz, who's not here, but Danielle was asking if there were codes that the sanatoriums were following, which is not, I don't know the answer to that, but I thought that was an interesting question of how the health revolution in modern architecture was being regulated or not regulated, and what the sort of perhaps the legal mechanisms that were driving it. What other comments? Wendy was saying that hospitals still have underground tunnels. One thing I was thinking about when she was saying death in modern architecture is always hidden, all of the, I was thinking of former Governor Cuomo, who really is former Governor Cuomo in no small part for how he was intentionally undercounting COVID deaths in nursing homes so that his $5 million book contract would go over more smoothly. So I think this idea of death being hidden is, there's also a lot of controversy about how many people have actually died of COVID. I think we don't really know. There's a lot of suspicion, maybe conspiracy theories of undercounting. And Beatriz is back.
She's reconnecting. Do we think maybe one more question before folks?
I'm so
like,
sorry.
hi, you're back.
Welcome back.
Welcome back.
With Mia about what it's a very, very important question, Mia, because I mean, for a long time we have worked with this idea of and it's about time. And as I say, you know, I mean, I really like to point out that this whole thing of Americans with disabilities started with the students of architecture. And I want to tell you that because students have agency. And this happened in Berkeley in the 70s with the Center for Independent Living. And as I say, it's very, very important that about all these questions, that you realize that you have much more agency than you think. And this particular collaboration with, they team up with a professor, they went to these disabled veterans that were trying to make not only their campus, but their housing, and they collaborated. And this is super important. And as you say, involve other aspects, including what is considered a healthy body, what is considered an acceptable body type, and all these questions that they seem that they are not relevant for architecture, but they are super relevant because we are precisely in the business of housing these bodies, right? Anyway,
we're going to take one more question. I'm going to throw it to you, Elliot. But I put in the chat, Joel Sanders, your former colleague, Beatriz, is really at the forefront of this idea of the changing body. Take it away, Elliot.
Yeah, Beatriz, I loved your presentation, and there's a lot of things that I want to mention, but I think the main thing that sticks out to me is architecture as this like empathetic act. You talk a lot about you know, different kind of collaborations between doctors and engineers and architects as they kind of form this thing. And I think maybe, do you have any opinions on like how architecture is kind of feels like you know, there's this kind of removal from this interdisciplinary thing happening? You know, how do you see that kind of unfolding between you know, into the future between doctors and you know, other places like that of architecture?
It's interesting that you asked this question, because in fact, I think that we lost the connection, you know, literally. I mean, from Vitruvius, to the Renaissance, to Viollet-le-Duc, to modern architects and their emphasis on tuberculosis, there is very strong collaborations between architects and doctors, and we lost that connection. And this is very important because, I mean, I was on sabbatical last time, 2 or 3 years ago, and I was in a Center for Advanced Studies in Berlin that was full of scientists, biologists in particular. And because I was working on this book on X-ray architecture, we started having conversations about this time in which there were so many collaborations between architects and doctors. And these people were telling me, but why are we not talking more now, precisely when there are, as I was describing before, all these new bacteria resistant to antibiotics, all these problems that are caused by the building itself. So hospital architecture became this specialized thing in which we are hardly involved as thinkers or as architects. It's done by these big firms, and it's creating a huge amount of problems. So it's about time that we regain this this connection with other fields of study and collaborate in producing healthier buildings.
Can we take one more?
Yeah, sure.
Sydney?
Hi, yes. So one thing that I found interesting was the pandemic almost causing a forced regression or an adaptation. Someone mentioned earlier how they want to return to how life was before COVID instead of this new normalcy. So my question is how in the past homes have taken the trend of having these open concept ideas, but with COVID, that seems to have declined as people have to find private spaces to attend school and work from home. And this seems to relate to the qualities the home had in the 19th century, with the streaming services replacing our libraries. So as we leave our homes less and less, do you see the reinvention of the home over the past 18 months as regressing into the past or providing this new confining future?
I didn't hear very well because the sound was not perfect, but I think, of course, the house has been transformed radically in the last 2 years, and in fact, this is because pandemics, in fact, they almost never. What they do very well is to expose what is already there. So this trend towards a different kind of life was already underway, and Kathy mentioned before the work on the bed, precisely the 24 bed, and the idea that we as workers were spending more and more time in different conditions. I mean, after the 2008 economic crisis, thousands, millions of people, younger people in particularly, were working in the gig economy from their beds at the same time that office buildings were being kind of half empty, right? So we are living in a way in obsolete cities, cities that were the result of the Industrial Revolution, of the radical separation, which I have no doubt in my mind that must have been extremely traumatic for the generation that went through that, the radical separation between the place of living and the place of work, whether it's an office or a factory, right? All of a sudden you have to commute. And we are in a way kind of returning to some sort of pre-industrial way of living with much more work in the home. Well, that means that we have a lot to think about, and we have as architects, right? And a trend that was already underway has been accelerated with the pandemics, as it usually happens. And now we're in a different condition in which the house returns to be also a place of work for many people, and this hybrid, and therefore we have to rethink this house, right? I'm not so sure if I answer all your questions because it was, as I say, I was trying to guess what you could be saying, but maybe somebody can help and translate for me what if the question was different.
That was great, a great set of discussions. Thank you very much, Beatriz. I guess Blaine is gonna send it off, but I just want to conclude by it's eerie, this work on health of yours. It reminds me so much of what happened when Privacy and Publicity came out. It just made us see all this work that we thought we knew in an entirely different way, and now you're doing it again. It's really remarkable, and I'll just be waiting for what the next book will be.
Thank you, Thomas. That's very generous of you.
I would agree, Thomas. It's remarkable how prescient X-ray architecture was in terms of our current condition. I don't know if you had any of those thoughts of anticipating change like we've seen, but I love that this kind of historical analysis that's so important to remove this kind of intentional, kind of forgetfulness, to enlighten us about what we've seen before, and the agency that architecture has had, but also the incredible limitations and remaining questions and possibilities of seeing things anew. How all those ideas apply to our present and future experience with architecture. So I want to thank you so much for giving us so much to think about, Beatriz, and also to Thomas and students, Peter and Caddy and Greer for supporting this lecture series. And everyone have a wonderful afternoon and weekend.
Thank you very much to all of you. It was very stimulating for me to hear your thoughts and to have your questions. Thank you so much. Thank you, Blaine. Thank you, Thomas.
Bye, Beatriz.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you.